Hello, everyone. It's good to see you again, if you saw me before. My name's Noah. I lead the design team at Figma, and I'm super excited to be here with you for this panel about change and change management. And to get started, what we're going to do is just introduce ourselves and say kind of what you do, what you work on. And we asked this question in an earlier panel. It's kind of fun. If you weren't in design or what you're doing today, what's something you might have thought you'd be doing or would want to do? And so we'll start in the end, and then we'll go across. Sorry.
Right. So name, serial number.
Yeah, social security, all that, yeah.
OK. I'm Alberta Soranzo. You see my face somewhere up there. I am group head for customer experience at Vodafone Business Group. So not in any specific country, and I lead a team of designer and analysts that look at the B2B side of Vodafone. If I wasn't in my job, how many choices do I have?
All the careers in the world.
So I wanted to be a firefighter, because my favorite cartoon when I was little was about a little dragon that was a firefighter.
That's cool.
A dairy farmer sounded appealing, or airline pilot.
Ooh. All three great options, very different options.
Yeah, very different.
Cool, nice.
Nice. Hi everyone, I'm Mike. I'm head of design for Reed, reed.co.uk. The Reed organisation is sort of one of the biggest recruiters in the UK. The organisation handles sort of every part of recruitment, but my team, sort of a team of product designers and digital designers and researchers, is just really, we sort of deliver all the digital experiences, mostly for sort of a big job board, basically, for both customers and sort of B2C and B2B. I think other careers, when I was a kid, I would have really liked to be a professional basketball player, but unfortunately I stopped growing when I was 15.
Muriel, Naim, and I am the VP of Design, Research, and UX, because it's a startup, you know how it goes, at Fabric, which is a headless e-commerce platform, and B2B, B2C, do a lot of stuff. Previously, I was in Disney and ABC and Walmart, a bunch of big corporations, leading UX architecture as well as product design, kind of like in my hands until I grew the teams. Different profession. When I was younger, I was very set on being an astronaut pilot for many years. And then it changed. And I was much more interested in human behavior. So I would probably be a psychologist or a psychiatrist or bridging the gap between them, something about processes.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, I feel like there's so many things we do in design, and psychology is obviously such a huge part of that. And to imagine a world where you're like getting even deeper into any of the stuff that we do seems really exciting. I answered the question earlier, but I kind of want to like change an answer, maybe say something different this time. Like maybe something in architecture or interior design would be kind of fun. I feel like it's super hard, and I wouldn't be very good at it, but I like the idea of understanding how things are made around you and helping make those experiences better. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap with UX design in the ways that you have to think about spaces and how people move through them and stuff, so something around that. But we're not here to talk about architecture. We are here to talk about change. Obviously, a big word, a loaded word, can mean a lot of things in a lot of contexts. But in this context here, it can mean, let's call it a few things. It can mean influencing a change in your company. It could be the process. It could be, if you're in a growing company, what processes need to kind of change. It could be even things like if the market requires a change for you to influence in some way. So obviously a broad definition, but learning how to handle change is probably one of the most important themes we're working with in general these days, right? Things happen so quickly, we need to adapt, and it's hard to do that. And so for me personally, at least at Figma, there's been kind of two articulations of that. There's been helping companies make changes to change the tool they're using, which is hard. You've got thousands and thousands of people who are used to one way of doing something, and we're having to figure out how to influence change for them when it makes sense. But then there's also the reality of being at a growing startup. I joined Figma 5 years ago. We were about 25 people. We're almost 900 people now, and over those 5 years, you have to influence a lot of change. And so throughout, I'll try to chime in here and there on what that's looked like, where it makes sense. But to start, for the panelists, just when you hear that word, if a story comes to mind for you, I know it's kind of broad, but whether it's a change you had to implement in the company when you were there or at a past company, just any anecdote that comes to mind where you had to kind of see a change happen and what kind of happened in that environment. So take it wherever you want, whoever wants to start.
I'm happy to start. In my current role at Reed, it's been quite a nice experience because I was brought in to essentially affect a lot of change. It was a company with not sort of a lot of design maturity. There was a design team that was doing good work, but there's probably a lot of changes that need to be made, and I had buy-in from the business to do that. So, and was given the time to really look at everything, design sort of a clear product design strategy to deliver everything, sort of tools, extra people, changes to ways of working, all those kind of things. And it was all agreed and implemented quite easily, which is quite nice. But it's nice to have a good experience, because I've also been on the other side when it's been done really badly. Like, I was in a much larger organisation before when we made some really positive changes. It was sort of quite a while ago. It was sort of a really large design organisation, still split along sort of UX and UI sides. We moved everyone into product design. Everyone became product designers overnight. Also, there was sort of a wide range of different ways of working. Some people were in agile teams, some people were in waterfall teams, a lot of people halfway between. The entire organisation, thousands and thousands of people, the entire digital organisation, all moved into empowered product teams, which is a great change. But all this kind of happened at once. And it was done with almost no consultation. And so people's jobs changed overnight, their ways of working changed overnight. People were really scared. There was a real absence of information. People tried to do that. But it led to sort of a fair bit of churn, and as a leader kind of bringing that through, just a huge amount of heartache. So I think things I learned with that is just the more communication and the more planning that can come into this kind of large change, the better.
Yeah, that's interesting. What have you seen moments where there's been like good communication around change? Are we talking about an email message? Is it like, how does that even show up? Yeah, is it Slack message? Like, what is the ways that you've heard or seen that show up, either there or wherever? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the key thing is it can't just be top down. It has to be bottom up as well. There's some things that sort of have to come from the top if we're talking about sort of hiring new people, sort of changing teams around, that's fine. But in terms of sort of ways of working, how we're all going to work together, that has to be done sort of bottom up, and it has to be consulted, because even if we're changing to something better, there's always things that were working before. There's always people that were working really hard, and a lot of the problems that were there, it's not because everyone was an idiot, it's because there were problems they were trying to solve and they weren't able to solve them. So without that consultation, which I've seen in some places, it just leads to a lot of anger.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, people need to know kind of the reason behind things when they're happening, and that kind of clear articulation can be super helpful. So either of you, any stories that come to mind when you think about change, either that you had to implement or that you saw happen at the company, and any anecdote that comes to mind when you think about this?
I mean, this is something that has happened to me in my current job and in my previous job. I generally get brought in to either create or reestablish or reposition design organizations in large corporate, not by trade, it's just what happens. And so the big change is a change in perception that you're trying to support, a change in thinking, and that's that design is no longer, the organization doesn't want design any longer to be the cute little thing you do at the very end, make this thing pretty, but turn us into a customer-centric organization, which is a completely different ball game. And it's interesting because, Mike, you were talking about how change scares an organization. Designers really terrify an organization, right? Because we dress different, talk different, act different, and believe in fundamentally different things. And I think part of alleviating the fear comes with knowing what any good researcher knows, and that is that you cannot do things to people. If you really want to achieve outcomes, you need to do things with people, make them part of the process. And that's, especially when you're looking at bottom-up ways of working type of change, I think it's fundamental. You know, the buy-in doesn't come because you send a cute email, doesn't come because you issue a new playbook. It's because you say, hey, I know a few things about design, but you know everything about your organization. Help me understand, and let's see how we can do it. But the most important thing for me is how do you communicate the importance of this change? I want to say the value of design because that's the things that McKinsey publishes, but you know, the importance for the organization. And that comes with a localization of our language as designers for corporate, for senior leadership. So I think My favorite business book, it has to be The Little Prince. I don't know, how many of you have read The Little Prince? Few of them. How many of you consider it a business book? Yeah, one. Didn't think so. So at the very beginning, it talks, if you've not read it, go out and buy it. It's, I don't know, less than 100 pages. But at the very beginning, the Little Prince, there is this fictional little prince that meets a pilot who gets stranded in the desert and talks about his exploration of planets and how children and adults talk about different things. Talk about the same thing in different ways. So if I buy a house, you might ask me, how much did it cost you? How many square meters is it? What was the, what is the zoning on the land? A child will ask me, what color is the roof? Can I play hide and seek? So adults and children look at the same thing in different ways and talk about it in different ways. And we need to do the same thing. So we need to translate our design speak and our design lingo into something that the organization can appreciate. And it's only when we act like the children in The Little Prince, I think, that we're able to bridge that gap and make change less strange and less scary.
Do you think that means, I love that analogy and that example, do you think it means using the language they're using, or does it mean shifting the language to something else to help them see that change, or which has happened for you, if either?
I like the concept of Trojan horses. And in corporate especially, numbers are the best Trojan horse. So if you tell your CFO that you want to spend $600,000 because you want a new research program, or you want to buy quantum metrics to do, to analyze some journeys, they will say, that's cute, but no. But if you tell them, by spending this $600,000, I can save you $2 million, or I can help you make $5 million more, then it's a completely different conversation. So it's not a matter of radically changing how we speak, but also adding that layer of translation into what it means for people that have a completely different frame of reference.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great advice in general. Yeah, so any other kind of moments where you've seen change happen, or it's kind of come up for you that you want to share?
So when I joined just this startup, I really wanted to I realized there's, again, as always, a very, very small amount of designers compared to the enormous amount of engineering folks, as always. So I really wanted to bring the system that I built for Disney, which was interestingly the similar case. So design is typically underappreciated, as I said yesterday, and I say again, and we really need to evangelize how to change that. But we do have to work with numbers. We do have to be very personable, empathetic, smart, and a little bit manipulative in order to grab this Trojan horse and push it into a place in which, even with numbers, they may not still understand the importance of good design, not just design, good design, which sometimes requires more time and more people. So I did it before in Disney, and I was able to kind of pull some numbers and kind of manage Scrum teams with engineering and somehow push in design. And then I went to this startup, and I wanted to implement these ways of working that is really centralizing the team again, so that we can have equal amount of work for everyone, so that I can see what everyone is doing, because they can have peer reviews, they can have retros, they can have like internal, external sharing, and a lot of like kind of pollination of how things work, as well as support the whole organization, 70 domains, which is over the top. And I realized that the organization equals design to high fidelity prototypes alone. And it took me a second to realize that. I didn't realize how far behind they were in understanding what is good design for real. So sometimes it's also about educating, and it's not condescending. People sometimes don't know. Before the design system as well, I was like, okay, design system, we're going to save this amount of time, X amount of, X, Y, Z, percentage of engineering and time and storybook, and it's obviously going to save all this engineering money. It wasn't enough because some people didn't understand what that even is. So I had to explain what design system is from the grounds up for the full company, and that drove an enormous amount of change. So I felt weird explaining such a basic term, but sometimes it's just about this empathy and meeting people where they're at, and speaking a little bit in their language to your question. I do think you did that too with the financial officer, right? Because you spoke in numbers, that's what they know. So yeah, each team requires something different, and I'm really pushing my designers to be like, hey, you need to educate. It's okay. Be patient, please. You need to educate. You don't always know.
Yep, yeah, and to build on that, it's like there are moments where we're finding ourselves having to articulate a change or what we're about to do, like in the example of that design system. There's also moments where if we have the privilege or time to do it, demonstrating or showing something can be one of the best ways to make change too. So in that example, it's like if there's time or bandwidth to even just show someone who's wondering what this thing is, what that new change looks like or what the design is. And even at a micro level, if you're the first designer at a startup and that startup doesn't know what design is yet, and you're probably not going to have the time because the startup has a lot of asks of you to try to say, oh, here's what I do. You're probably just doing it. And hopefully, if you're doing it well enough, they are inspired enough to like kind of want to continue that function or grow it as the company grows. But it's not always easy to do that. Maybe one anecdote I was thinking of, because you were talking about like centralizing the team, you brought them together because you needed to see them together. That reminds me of a change we sort of made, and it was kind of a small one. When we were a small team, we sat together, and there were 3, 4 of us, and that kind of worked for us. We liked to jam, and we liked to collaborate, but there was always this kind of lingering question of, should we be sitting with our engineering teams instead? Should we really integrate ourselves? And it didn't become obvious that a change was needed until we grew, and we grew to a point where engineers were walking over to the design area constantly, and it was just like, something feels wrong about this. Like we're really building something together, and yet implementing that change wasn't straightforward because you've got a team of people who may not all agree on that change, right? So like some of the designers were like, of course, like I want to sit with the engineers. Some of them were like, no, like I actually kind of really enjoy this. And this is pre-pandemic, of course. Post, I think that actually made that conversation a lot easier. You didn't have to think at all about where people were sitting, which is kind of in its own way kind of interesting, like that kind of change too. I don't know how much that's already been talked about during the conference, but we can touch on that as well if that affected anyone's way of working.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because I've had that exact same experience in multiple organizations now where we've sort of moved to sort of an empowered product team model, where obviously, like what I always say with my organization now is that the designers team is their product team. They're part of the design organization. We all work together, communicate, have sort of our ways of working, but their team is their product team. And so obviously it makes sense to sit with them. But in various organizations, it's sort of quite funny that designers have often been the most reluctant to actually sit with their team. Like, designers really like sort of working with other designers and bouncing ideas off, which makes perfect sense. They're like, we want to have a creative space, we want to work together, but in sort of modern product design, it just makes more sense to be sitting with the rest of your team. But it is funny, I mean, obviously, like, that's sort of often sort of the leader of change. It's actually my sort of organization and team that actually the one I have to work the hardest with to kind of get them to sit with the rest of them.
Yeah, because change is such a broad topic, I like these examples because you can kind of pick at them and be like, okay, what's going on there? And with that one, sometimes I think about it as like, if design is, you mentioned earlier, understaffed at most companies, it can be a kind of a lonely or isolating role. You're like looking around to see, like, does anyone kind of else see what's going on? Or do we, feel the same way? And so sitting together makes a ton of sense in that context where it can be a therapy group, but it can also be a chance to, generate a bunch of stuff. But fortunately, if there are ways to influence change in the way people see the role, then they can hopefully have those same kind of moments when they're with a different group of people. And they're literally, at least for me, like I get the most energy when I'm jamming with someone on something. Like literally just that almost like improvisational back and forth when you're coming up with an idea or working through a problem. That stuff is really fun regardless of like the role or who's there. And so, yeah, it's interesting how each of these examples of change might come with different constraints or different challenges. Yeah.
And add to that, so it's not just that we're centralized. You have to have an enormous amount of interaction with all different portions. Otherwise, it just won't come out good, period. No way. If you're in isolation, it will not work. So a bunch of the things that we did to adjust. By the way, we adjust the process, the ways of working in my organization almost every sprint, since we have retros, and I really want to hear from people what worked, what didn't work, and then we have immediate action items, and then we integrate these action items the next week. So it's like an ever-changing ways of working, and we try to pull in a bunch of other people to weigh in as well. Something might have gone not the best way. I don't like saying wrong, but can we make it better? How? It's actionable item everything. So you don't just stay like, oh, this was bad, this was good. I don't like the word bad. What didn't work? Can we make it better? So one of the things we did, just to close that loop, is that we have stakeholders, and these stakeholders are essential. Without them, we cannot start. We do have our own board. I'm a big big advocate for that. I can explain later why. But one of the things we have to have, because we have our own board, and it's separate from the other boards, is that we have to pick a backend engineer stakeholder from the inception through the low-fidelity prototype, which is, I would argue, the most important step before you go into design. Visual design, which is kind of automated in many ways, if you can, the design systems in a way. And also invite a PO and a PM. And without these three stakeholders in a room for big features, we're not moving forward. And this is big, because those are table stakes. And without them, I do think you work in isolation, and you may create a very beautiful, fun, tricky thing, but it may not work for this trifecta of important people and their customers. So it's about both in a way. If you can pull them in, awesome.
Yep. So another thing I'm wondering about with change here is whenever there is one that's introduced and there's a moment where people are having to make an adjustment in their process, their way of working, how do you, is there a moment, I read something recently that was talking about having these if you're, we grew to a size where we could no longer be in the same critiques. We used to all be in the same room, having those jam sessions, whatever. You get to a point you just can't do that. We even had a stand-up channel where people would post their work, and it just didn't scale with the number of people. And so what we did was we read that it was kind of a fun idea to almost mourn your past processes, but in a fun kind of way, almost like throwing a party for a goodbye party to the last process. And I always thought that was a super interesting concept to sort of just be hey, we know that this type of change might be hard. You might be used to doing this for a while, so let's grieve that out in whatever way you need to. Literally, we made a highlights reel of the posts people did in those different, in that old channel that was going away, so people could feel yeah, that was a cool moment, and now we're in a new moment, and we're going to do something different. I guess, do any of you have examples where you had some people that were still kind of holding on to this old thing, and you were like, oh, please, we're in this for whatever reason. The business changed, the team size changed. Anything that comes to mind for either of you where you had to kind of pull someone along, or maybe whatever kind of happened through that?
So I expect this is different depending on the organization, primarily size, age, scale, maturity. What I've seen in my teams is, because at least in the last few jobs I've worked with fairly sizable design teams, there is some sort of Darwinian selection. If you struggle with not so much accepting the change, but with adaptation to a different way of working, not sitting next to your colleagues, rather than doing whatever it was that you're used to, eventually you self-select and move on. And it's a terrible thing, because sometimes you lose very valuable people. But at the same time, I feel it's part of, it's the best for them. Some people really do struggle with just radically disrupting the way they're used to doing things, and that's totally fine. I suppose the best adaptation, so the flip side of that, seeing people absolutely resistant to anything that they saw happening on paper or on a screen or and rejected outright attempts at connections that weren't sanctioned by some protocol in their mind, exclusively in their mind. And I've seen them turn around when they were approached by, again, Trojan horses are my favorite animal at this point, but by younger, more junior members of the team generally. It was not by design, it was a very organic process, but who were asking for mentoring, but who in reality were mentoring them back. And it's a beautiful thing to witness.
That's a great thing to hear, especially because I've been hearing that the industry isn't making enough space for entry-level designers, and hearing that is a good reminder for companies of you think of it as, oh, well, we're spending all this time training this new individual on the team, but you're right, it's kind of bi-directional. The people doing the mentoring, I don't know if any of you have hired interns before or new grads, the energy shift is really palpable. These are people who are coming in hungry, excited, and I know a lot of companies are worried about the change of, can we support a designer who hasn't done this before, but you're absolutely right. It's so noticeable when the team is like, they look and they want to help, and all of a sudden there's just like a different, it's almost, I mean, maybe this is too meta or too philosophical, but there's a change in life all the time, and we're constantly like evolving and seeing new students and young people going through things, and if you're not embracing that, then, I don't know, are you living? Are you even, so anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose, sorry, Mike, just to conclude the thought, I suppose this is one of the advantages of working in enterprise. There aren't very many, but one of them is that tendentially they're fairly design immature, so they don't even think about, well, will you have the energy and time to support someone fresh out of school, because we have graduate schemes and we have internships, et cetera, et cetera. So you sneak them through, effectively.
Trojan horses everywhere, yeah. Cool.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, but no, I just completely agree. That balance in the team is so important. We actually had a junior designer start this week. I wasn't there most of the week because I'm here, but it is great because if you speak to any product team, sort of the product manager, everyone else in the team, they prefer to have a senior, but not all the work is going to be senior, and it's not helpful for energy for sort of team morale to have a whole team of seniors as well. Having that balance is really important, and actually sort of it's exciting for everyone to see people grow and develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we added recently our first design ops hire, which is a function that I'm sure is relatively newer in some ways, but in other ways there's been forms of like program management and versions of it inside of disciplines for decades. But it's been really cool because I think as leaders we probably spend a lot of our time thinking about how we help change our organizations, but when you have like a partner in crime who doesn't also have the bandwidth of managing large sets of people, but can actually think about how that organization's working, it's almost like what I think consultants, I've never been one, so I don't know exactly what that works like, but I'd imagine that that's part of the advantage, is you can kind of come in with this fresh perspective, you're looking at how effective it is from the outside and kind of suggesting changes. And so far, it's been amazing. Kai, we brought in, and has been like wonderful in thinking about onboarding processes for people, and that's a form of change. Someone's coming into a new job, and they're trying to learn what it's like and how to do it. And I think another thing we've been trying there that was interesting is like thinking about change as experiments sometimes too, which is maybe depending on the company you work for, I don't know how controversial of a term it is, but for us it's just like, can we not think of change as such a drastic shift and instead just be like, why don't we just try it this week? And it's not like you're announcing and you're planning the, whatever, a big reorg or something, but you're like, hey, this week we want to try this thing. I think you had alluded to that too in talking about some forms of these sprints and so on. So yeah, I don't know, there's, if that incited anything, if there's anything you're thinking about, then maybe one or two more responses, and then if we have time, we'll do some questions.
I'm really intrigued by new members of the team. It doesn't have to be a junior person. I always ask for two things from them because they're invaluable. They have fresh eyes, everything. We don't have fresh eyes, anything. So we don't really know what sucks and what's working. So the first thing I say is, hey, you're new. I don't mind your role, your level, doesn't matter. I want you to write me, just kind of write a diary every day of the things you have to go through. If it's onboarding, if it's company onboarding, or teams onboarding, documents, be the most critical you can possibly be. And give me a diary of your first week. I want to know exactly what worked, what didn't work, and can you make it better? That's the only way I can actually have real eyes into what's happening. The second thing is I love not letting people know any background. I don't want them to read anything about the product. I want them to go through a product suite and see what they figure out themselves and what's not. Now, some of the things are high-end or very niche customer base, so they need to know a bit more. But I love throwing them into the things that are more like, interestingly, admin level are many times like really high roles in some really big companies, such as GNC and Chico's and Gap even. So sometimes people are actually not fully connected to the smaller roles, or like, that was a really wrong word, lower layer roles. There's no small, big role. And I like sending them into just writing me, again, good, medium, bad, anything you saw that you really liked, anything you see that you really don't like, and why. It's invaluable. You can never get it again.
There's a few things I think are interesting about that. Like I think the idea of intermixing roles as well, and like you mentioned, just through hierarchy in a company, are people actually interacting with different roles, let alone people in their own functions. And I've been at companies where everyone takes a role in the support team for a week, or or in our company we have every employee join a critique, a design critique. Like doesn't matter what function you're in. We don't. It's not like we like tie your hand to it. It's optional, but we highly encourage it, and it's awesome. It's really fun to get to learn about each other's disciplines and what happens, and it's a great way to also help with change, because what you're doing is you're kind of smoothing things out a little bit, where people build empathy for their roles and what they have to do. And if there's that layer of trust there and they kind of understand it better, then they're more likely to be more malleable or want to be interested in shifting something together because you know where you're coming from. So we're almost out of time, and I wanted to make sure that if there were any questions, either if you're trying to work on a change personally in your company or you've experienced one that you want to share. I know it's tricky to do audience questions historically, but if there is one.
Or about ways of working, because I think that was essentially the original...
Changing ways of working.
Ways of working, yeah, if you have any question about that.
Either one works. And if not, if any of the panelists have other anecdotes you wanted to share but didn't get a chance to share.
How many centralized teams are here of design and or research? Like if you're in a team that is only designers or only researchers and you feed other places, can you raise your hand? Wow, very little. Interesting. That's like the underdog? Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean centralized, like just all the designers together in the same, yeah.
They feed other departments?
We got one.
Yeah, first, thanks for all these insights. That was really, really fun to listen to. So I have a question, and it's about feedback loops within establishing these new ways of working. How do you make sure that the feedback you get is honest?
Good question.
It's a great question. I mean, I think, well, when in the example I talked about before, where we implemented sort of large-scale change, we got a lot of direct feedback. Some people, the more confident people, were very vocal in giving that. But I mean, in our organisation, we were sort of conducting multiple surveys. We had sort of lots of workshops to try and find out, using lots of different methods to try and get feedback on how it was all working. But the problem with that, as I said, was a lot of that was sort of after the fact. The decisions have been made. We're already making the change, and then we're getting the feedback afterwards. It would have been nice to try and make the whole thing a bit more collaborative and consultative at the start.
I have a few. I was thinking about while you were talking. It's great to be the second speaker, because then you can think. The first one is modeling. You have to show it yourself, and modeling not just by giving feedback, by getting feedback as well. As a head of a department, it's maybe a bit unusual, but I do that sometimes. Like, can you give me feedback about the offsite we just had? Please. Feedback is caring. If you don't care, you won't give me feedback. Can you care and give me feedback? And the second thing is framework. That's really big. There's a lot of really blunt feedback givers. They're not really useful to many people. There's sensitivity, and a lot of designers are introverted. So I set up the ground rules or guardrails for giving feedback properly, because there's honesty and there's bluntness and there's caring direct feedback. I think direct is caring. And there is not nice feedback and not kind feedback. So to set up the guardrails, and you can set it your own way with your own company and how you usually speak, and then say it in the beginning of every meeting as a reminder, every meeting of feedback giving. At some point it will become second nature, but in the beginning it's important. And call people out directly when something is off. So I recently had to give an example. Actually, you know what? I can talk about something old that was really, really tough. Someone was very smart and very talented. That was like 2.5 years ago. And he came in, he was an architect, and he gave a feedback that was really horrifying in a way that wasn't constructive. So what he noted was correct. But the way he said it was so mean and not useful. I called him out immediately in the meeting, live. He said, this is, I don't know if it's very pretty. I think it's a little ugly. I think the placement is incorrect, and X, Y, Z. So kind of put it as it is, without any constructive words. And it wasn't building. It wasn't challenging the next teammate. And I called him out right away. I was like, OK, that's not very useful. What doesn't work in it specifically? Can you give me specifics? And then do you have an idea of maybe how might we make it better? Just reshaping it live, so calling out, excuse me, assholes. But also, then speaking to them later and saying, hey, I want your feedback. I want you to frame it better. Do you want to work with me on that? We can do a workshop. That's important. The other way around as well. If you have introverts, call them out. Hey, what do you think about that? How do you think it may have been done better? Do you have any ideas? So you have to call people out. You have to set up the ground for that.
This is a great question. Thank you for asking. I wish we had more time, because I feel like feedback alone probably could easily be like a whole half-hour discussion in itself. There's so much nuance in it, even cultural differences between companies and the way that feedback lands in those different places. So really, really great one. But unfortunately, we're out